Another setting that we saw when I created the virtual machine was the memory setting. What the memory setting allows me to do is specify a certain amount of RAM for startup. The primary purpose of specifying startup RAM is to make sure my virtual machine does not exceed that when I power up the machine. If you have a database server like a SQL server or an Exchange server, they can consume a lot of memory on startup, which can degrade performance of other virtual machines. So I can set this to whatever I believe is appropriate. Separate from startup RAM is the option to enable dynamic memory. When I create the virtual machine, I can choose to enable or disable dynamic memory, but I can't set the value. So after the machine's created, I can come back here to dynamic memory and I can set a minimum and maximum amount of RAM that this VM will not exceed. This also lets me specify a buffer. The buffer is just how much memory is held in reserve. If I have something like a database server again, it may need a lot of memory on demand. So I can tell Hyper-V, this VM right now may be using 3 gigs of RAM, but reserve 20% of this in case there is a burst of memory that's actually needed. The last setting is the memory weight. The purpose of the memory weight is to prioritize which virtual machine will get the memory. A real-life example. Let's say my server has 16 gigs of RAM. I go to this virtual machine and I allocate 12 gigs of RAM at a maximum here. I go to another virtual machine and I also allocate 12 gigs of RAM. Well, my server only has 16 gigs of RAM. If both of these virtual machines attempt to use all 12 gigs of RAM, physically I don't have enough in the server to allocate to both VMs. So what I can do is specify the weight. The higher your weight, the higher your priority. The lower your priority. So let's say for one VM, I move this all the way to high. The other VM, I leave it in the center. The virtual machine that has the highest setting will be the virtual machine that actually gets the memory. So it just lets me say, I prefer for this VM to get the memory instead of another VM. Now that's only relevant if you exceed the maximum amount of memory in your server. Otherwise, every VM will get whatever resources it actually needs, but helps us when there is a contention for those resources.